There are places in England where history doesn't fade, it waits. And among them, one stands silent still, where music was once heard long after the fire had burned cold. In the damp, cobbled lanes of Islington, just beyond the reach of gaslight's steady hum, there once stood a modest dressmaker's shop, its windows frosted with age and its door forever ajar, as though expecting someone who never came. It belonged to Miss Caldwyn, a woman whose name, though absent from society pages, lingered in whispers among the seamstresses of Mayfair and the laundresses of Clerkenwell. She was known not for flamboyance, but for a peculiar grace, an uncanny ability to craft gowns that seemed to breathe upon the wearer, as if woven not only from silk and taffeta, but from something far more intimate. Miss Caldwyn arrived in London in the autumn of 1863, a quiet figure with eyes the colour of storm-washed slate and fingers that moved with the precision of a surgeon. She spoke little, accepted few commissions, and yet her reputation grew like ivy along a crumbling wall, slow, inevitable, and strangely beautiful. Her clients were not the titled elite, but rather those on the fringes of gentility, widows with dwindling fortunes, actresses between engagements, young women whose prospects had dimmed like tarnished silver. They came to her seeking not merely finery, but transformation, and they received it. Witnesses later recalled how a woman who entered Miss Caldwyn's shop burdened by sorrow would emerge draped in a gown that seemed to lift her very spirit, how the fabric would ripple with a life of its own when she turned, how the hem would brush the floor with a sigh rather than a rustle. Some claimed the dresses retained the scent of their wearers long after they'd been returned for alterations. Jasmine for one, pipe smoke for another, even the faint metallic tang of tears. It was not until the winter of 1871 that unease began to coil beneath admiration. A young clerk from a neighbouring haberdashery reported hearing, late at night, the sound of a needle pulling thread through cloth, steady, rhythmic, endless, though the shop's windows were dark and its door locked. Others spoke of seeing Miss Caldwyn walking alone through the fog, her arms wrapped tightly around a bundle of fabric that seemed to shift beneath her shawl. Then came the disappearances. Not dramatic abductions, but quiet vanishings. Mr. Alistair Finch, a bookbinder with a penchant for poetry, last seen entering her shop to deliver a volume of Keats. Miss Beatrice Mallory, a governess newly dismissed from a household in Hampstead who had commissioned a mourning dress for a cousin she never mentioned. And finally, Mr. Edmund Voss, a violinist whose performances had grown increasingly erratic before he ceased appearing altogether. Each had been seen with Miss Caldwyn in the weeks prior. Each left behind personal effects, a pocket watch, a hairpin, a sheet of music, but no bodies, no letters of farewell, no trace beyond the lingering impression of their presence in her workroom. The first to suspect more than coincidence was Dr. Lionel Hargrave, a retired physician with a scholarly bent and a fascination for anomalies of the human psyche. Having lost his own wife to consumption years before, he had taken to cataloguing peculiar deaths and vanishings as a form of melancholy diversion. Drawn by rumour, he began discreet inquiries, visiting former clients and tradesmen alike. From their testimonies, a pattern emerged, not of violence but of absorption. One woman recalled how, after wearing her Caldwyn gown to a ball, she dreamt for weeks of a man's voice humming a lullaby she did not know. Another spoke of finding, stitched into the lining of her bodice, a lock of hair that was neither hers nor her maid's. Most unsettling was the account of Mrs. Thorne, a retired milliner, who claimed that when she held Miss Caldwyn's latest creation to the light, she saw, woven into the damask, the faintest outline of a human hand, palm open, fingers curled as if in sleep. Dr. Hargrave's curiosity hardened into obsession. He petitioned the local magistrate for access to Miss Caldwyn's premises after her sudden death in 1877, a death attributed to nervous exhaustion, though no physician had attended her. What he found defied explanation. The workroom was immaculate, every spool aligned, every pair of shears laid parallel. Yet in a locked chest beneath the floorboards, he discovered not bolts of fabric, but garments unlike any he had seen, gowns of extraordinary complexity, layered with hidden pockets, inner linings stitched in reverse, and seams that seemed to double back upon themselves like labyrinthine paths. Between the folds, he found fragments, a button engraved with initials, a dried violet, a strip of parchment bearing a single line in faded ink, "I keep you close, so you cannot leave." Most disturbing were the threads themselves, not merely silk or wool, but interwoven with strands of human hair, fine as cobweb, dyed to match the fabric yet unmistakable under magnification. Chemical analysis later confirmed traces of skin cells, saliva, even minute particles of bone. Hargreaves spent the remainder of his life attempting to reconcile what he had uncovered with the rational framework of his age. He corresponded with alienists in Vienna, consulted obscure texts on sympathetic magic, and even visited spiritualist circles, though he remained a skeptic to the end. His private journals, now housed in the archives of the Royal Society of Antiquaries, reveal a man increasingly haunted not by ghosts, but by the implications of love turned inward, twisted by grief into something both tender and terrible. He came to believe that Miss Caldwyn had not murdered her lovers, but preserved them, not in coffins but in couture, that each man and woman who entered her life became, through needle and thread, part of the very fabric she offered to the world. Not as trophies, but as companionship, woven into the hems, the collars, the hidden linings, so that they might never depart, never fade, never cease to move with her through the world. After Hargreaves' death in 1892, the shop was sealed and eventually demolished. The gowns were reportedly destroyed, though some say a single dress, ivory silk with silver-threaded vines, was spirited away by a collector of curiosities and later vanished from a private exhibition in Brussels. Today, nothing remains of Miss Caldwyn's workshop but a plaque marking a modern chemist's and the memory passed down among old families of dresses that moved when no one was near. Yet on still nights, when the fog rolls in from the Thames and muffles the clatter of carriages, residents of the street claim to hear it again, the soft, ceaseless sound of a needle drawing thread through cloth, steady, patient, eternal. And sometimes, if one stands very still outside the chemist's window, one might catch, just beneath the hum of the city, the faintest echo of a melody, as though sung by many voices at once, stitched together in harmony, forever unfinished. There are those who insist that Miss Caldwyn's story ended with the demolition of her shop. That time, as it so often does, buried the strange beneath the mundane. But memory, especially in London, is not so easily paved over. In the years following Dr. Hargreaves' death, scattered reports continued to surface, fleeting, fragmented, yet threaded with the same uncanny resonance. A dressmaker in Brighton claimed to have inherited a bolt of ivory silk from an anonymous benefactor. When she cut, into it she found, stitched between the layers, a wedding ring too small for any adult finger. A seamstress in Bath spoke of dreaming, night after night, of a woman with storm-grey eyes guiding her hands as she sewed, though she had never seen Miss Caldwyn's likeness in life. Even more unsettling were the accounts from women who had never commissioned a gown, but woke with the distinct sensation of being watched from within their own wardrobes, as though their garments held breath. The true persistence of the tale, however, lies not in rumour, but in record, specifically in a series of water-damaged ledgers discovered in 1923 during the renovation of a solicitor's office near Gray's Inn. These documents, once thought lost, contained Miss Caldwyn's private accounts, meticulously kept in a spidery hand. Among invoices for thread and boning were entries that defied commercial logic. Payment received in kind, voice, tenor, clear, settled with promise of return, bartered for memory of first kiss, summer of '68. One page, partially blotted by what appears to be rain or tears, bore a single notation: he said he would stay. So I made sure he did. The ledgers offered no explanation, only the quiet arithmetic of longing, rendered in ink and obligation. It was this discovery that reignited scholarly interest, most notably in the person of Miss Agatha Pembroke, a historian of material culture at Girton College. Unlike Hargrave, who sought pathology, Miss Pembroke approached the mystery through the lens of craft, how objects absorb intention, how repetition embeds ritual into routine. She spent months cross-referencing the ledger entries with Parrish. Records, shipping manifests and theatre programmes, slowly reconstructing the lives of those who had crossed Miss Caldwyn's threshold. What emerged was not a list of victims, but of volunteers, men and women adrift in a city of strangers, seeking connection in an age that prized propriety over intimacy. Mr. Finch, the bookbinder, had been mourning a stillborn child. Miss Mallory had been disowned after refusing an arranged marriage. Mr. Voss, the violinist, suffered from a tremor that threatened his livelihood. Each, in their own way, had offered themselves, not to death, but to preservation. Miss Pembroke's research led her to a revelation both poetic and chilling. In Victorian mourning customs, it was common to weave hair into keepsakes, brooches, watch chains, even picture frames, as a means of holding the departed close. Miss Caldwyn, it seemed, had extended this practice beyond the grave, applying it to the living. Her gowns were not merely garments, but reliquaries, stitched with the essence of those she cherished. The movement witnesses described was not supernatural but psychological, a projection of the wearer's subconscious, stirred by the presence of another's memory embedded in the very cloth against their skin. The rustle was not silk, but sigh, the drape not cut but caress. Yet even Miss Pembroke could not account for the final entry in the ledger, dated 3 days before Miss Caldwyn's death. Reserved for myself. Final stitch to be drawn at midnight. No gown matching this description was ever found. Some speculate she wore it to her own end, a shroud of her own making, woven with every voice, every glance, every whispered vow she had ever gathered. Others believe the dress was never completed, that the last thread remains suspended, waiting for a hand that will never return to pull it through. Today, the site of the shop is occupied by a modern apothecary, its shelves lined with tinctures and tonics, its windows bright with electric light. Yet on certain evenings, always when the air is thick with mist and the gas lamps flicker as though remembering their old duty, passers-by report a sensation not of cold, but of being gently enveloped as if by fabric. And if one listens closely, past the rumble of omnibuses and the chatter of late-night shoppers, there comes a sound so faint it might be imagination. The soft, rhythmic click of scissors closing, followed by the whisper of thread being drawn. Through silk, again and again, as though sewing time itself into something that will never unravel. The persistence of Miss Caldwyn's legacy, however, cannot be confined to anecdote or archival fragment. It lingers in the very texture of certain garments still held in private collections, their provenance obscured by time, yet unmistakable in their effect. In 1931, Lady Eleanor Winthrop of Sussex bequeathed to the Victoria and Albert Museum a ball gown of midnight blue tulle, its bodice embroidered with silver thread in a pattern resembling constellations. Curators noted its unusual weight, disproportionate to its materials, and upon closer inspection discovered minute seams hidden beneath the lining. Stitched not with cotton but with human hair, dyed to match the fabric, yet retaining a faint sheen under ultraviolet light. The gown was never displayed. Internal memos from the period cite unaccountable disturbances among staff, dreams of crowded rooms where no one spoke, the sensation of being gently tugged at the wrist while alone in the storage vault, and most persistently the sound of humming, low, wordless, and harmonized as if by several voices at once. The dress was eventually sealed in acid-free tissue and placed in a climate-controlled archive, where it remains, catalogued under a false provenance, what is perhaps most telling is not the object itself, but the silence that surrounds it. Museum records show repeated requests for access denied without explanation. Conservation notes abruptly cease in 1954 after a junior archivist reported finding, pinned to the gown's inner hem, a scrap of paper bearing the words, "He promised he would stay." The scrap vanished the next day. Such episodes are never documented in official histories, yet they circulate among those who work with textiles, the conservators, the mounters, the quiet custodians of forgotten things. They speak of certain dresses that refuse to lie flat on mannequins, that shift overnight as though adjusting their posture, or that emit, when handled, the faintest scent of bergamot and candle wax. Fragrance is not used in the museum's cleaning protocols, but consistent with descriptions from Miss Caldwyn's clients, this phenomenon extends beyond institutional walls. In 1978, a charity shop in Camden sold a Victorian-era wedding dress for £3 to a young bride-to-be. Within a week, the woman returned it, pale and trembling, claiming the dress had moved during her fitting, its train curling around her ankles like an embrace, its sleeves tightening when she tried to remove it. The shopkeeper, skeptical but unnerved, stored it in the back room. Days later, it was gone. No one admitted to taking it. The same year, a theatrical costumer in Stratford-upon-Avon reported acquiring a collection of period gowns from an estate sale in Islington. A high-necked day dress of dove-grey wool caused such unease among the wardrobe staff that it was never used in performance. Actors claimed it watched them from the rack. One dresser swore she saw its buttons gleam in the dark, though they were merely mother-of-pearl. These incidents, though disparate, share a common thread, not of malice, but of yearning. There is no violence in Miss Caldwyn's work, only an unbearable tenderness stretched beyond the limits of mortality. Her craft was not necromancy, but something far more human, the desperate attempt to hold on to what love insists must remain, even when reason dictates it must go. In an era that demanded women be vessels of restraint, she turned needle and thread into instruments of defiance, stitching absence into presence, silence into song. The horror, if it may be called that, lies not in the supernatural, but in the recognition of how deeply we wish to keep those we lose, not as memories, but as companions, as warmth against the skin, as breath in the hollow of the collar. Modern psychology might diagnose Miss Caldwyn with pathological attachment or delusional disorder, but such labels flatten the tragedy into pathology, stripping it of its sorrowful beauty. She did not seek to dominate, only to preserve. And in doing so, she created objects that exist in the liminal space between artifact and animate, things that are neither alive nor dead, but waiting. This is the true nature of the unease they provoke. Not fear of the unknown, but the uncanny sensation of being known, of being held in the mind of another long after that mind has ceased to function. Even now, scholars who study her work speak of a peculiar fatigue that settles over them after prolonged examination of her surviving pieces, a heaviness in the limbs, a sense of being gently pulled toward sleep, as though the gowns themselves are offering rest. One conservator interviewed anonymously in the 1990s described falling into a trance while repairing a torn seam on a Caldwyn bodice. She awoke hours later with her fingers stained with rust-colored thread that matched none in the museum's inventory, and a melody humming in her ears that she could not place, yet felt she had known all her life, the final truth, perhaps. Is this: Miss Caldwyn did not sew her lovers into her dresses. She sewed their promises, their vows of constancy, their whispered assurances of return, their declarations that they would never leave. These were the true materials of her craft. And because such promises once made cannot be unmade, they persist, not as ghosts, but as echoes woven into the warp and weft of fabric, waiting for a listener, a wearer, a believer. Thus, on certain nights, always when the wind carries the scent of wet stone and the city falls into a rare hush, One might stand outside the apothecary that now occupies her old address and feel it. Not a chill, but a presence soft as lining silk. And if the fog is thick enough, and the silence deep enough, one might hear, just beneath the distant toll of a church bell, the faintest sound of scissors closing, followed by the patient. Endless pull of thread through cloth, stitching, still stitching, as though love itself could be made to last forever. One careful seam at a time. It is said that objects remember what people forget. In the case of Miss Caldwyn, this axiom takes on a spectral weight, for her creations do not merely recall, they respond. Among textile historians, there exists an unspoken rule: never handle a suspected Caldwyn garment alone. Not out of superstition, but because of what happens in solitude. Multiple accounts, carefully redacted from public archives, yet whispered in conservation labs and university seminars, describe a phenomenon wherein the wearer, or even the mere observer, begins to experience memories that are not their own. A curator in Edinburgh, while examining a grey walking dress attributed to Caldwyn's later period, suddenly recalled the taste of burnt toast and the sound of rain on a slate roof, details she'd later matched to the childhood home of a vanished governess from 1874. Another, a graduate student at Oxford, fainted while measuring a sleeve cuff and awoke murmuring fragments of a lullaby in a dialect native to Cornwall, a region she had never visited. When questioned, she could not recall the tune, only the ache of its absence. These incidents suggest that Miss Caldwyn's method was not merely symbolic, but somatic. Her stitches functioned as conduits, binding not just fabric but sensory imprints. Contemporary theories in psychometry, though dismissed by mainstream science, find eerie validation in these cases. The idea that emotional energy can be absorbed by inanimate objects and later discharged under the right conditions. Miss Caldwyn, whether by instinct or design, mastered this transfer. Her needles did not pierce cloth alone. They punctured the veil between self and other, weaving identity into attire with such intimacy that the boundary dissolved. A gown was no longer worn, it wore back. It listened. It remembered. And in its own silent way it mourned. This reciprocity explains why so many of her clients returned again and again, even after their commissions were complete. They claimed the dresses fit better over time, that the seams softened in sympathy with their moods, that the fabric seemed to warm when they were lonely. One widow wrote in a private letter, later discovered tucked inside a hatbox in a Dorset attic, that she could not bring herself to remove her Caldwyn morning dress for weeks, not out of grief, but because it held him closer than the grave ever could. Such testimonials, though dismissed as sentimental fancy by Victorian moralists, reveal a deeper truth. Miss Caldwyn offered not illusion, but communion. In a society that demanded women suppress their desires, she gave them a way to carry their loves, not as burdens, but as second skins. The most compelling evidence of her technique lies not in garments, however, but in sound. In 1957, an audio archivist at the British Library was cataloguing wax cylinders from a defunct spiritualist society when he encountered a recording labeled simply Islington, 1899. The cylinder, badly warped, emitted only static at first. But after digital restoration in the 1980s, a faint melody emerged, played not on piano or violin, but on something resembling a music box. Its notes slightly uneven, as though wound by trembling hands. Beneath the tune, almost subliminal, were whispers, overlapping voices, male and female, speaking in hushed tones. Linguistic analysis identified phrases like, "I'm still here, don't let go, and she keeps us warm." Most chillingly, the voices did not speak over one another. They harmonized as if stitched together. The cylinder's origin remains unknown, but its location, Islington, and its date, just 22 years after Miss Caldwyn's death, suggest a connection too precise to dismiss. Some believe the recording captured an actual séance held in her former shop, long after it stood empty. Others theorize it was produced by the gowns themselves, vibrations resonating through the hair and bone fragments embedded in their seams, activated by changes in humidity or temperature, like the strings of an unseen instrument. Whatever the source, the recording was quietly removed from public access in 1991, following reports of staff experiencing auditory hallucinations after repeated playback. It now resides in a locked vault, its label blank. Miss Caldwyn's influence extended beyond her lifetime, not through fame, but through mimicry. In the decades following her death, a handful of obscure dressmakers, mostly women working in backstreet ateliers, began producing gowns with similar characteristics: hidden linings, asymmetrical hems, thread dyed with organic pigments that faded into skin tones. None admitted to knowing her methods, yet their work shared an uncanny kinship. One such seamstress, known only as Mrs. V in police records from 1893, was found dead in her Whitechapel flat, surrounded by half-finished dresses, each containing locks of hair and scraps of handwritten notes. The case was closed as suicide, but the garments disappeared before they could be inventoried. Whether these women were disciples or merely kindred spirits remains unknown. But their existence suggests that Miss Caldwyn's art was not singular. It was a language, and others had learned to speak it. Yet for all the echoes, the original voice remains the most haunting. In 2004, during an excavation for a new underground line near Old Street, workmen uncovered a sealed oak box buried beneath the foundation of a demolished tenement. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a single glove, left-handed kid leather, embroidered at the wrist with the initials EC. Interwoven with the stitching were strands of hair, dark and fine, and nestled in the palm a dried sprig of rosemary. The box bore no markings, but carbon dating placed it between 1875 and 1880. The glove was handed over to the Museum of London, where it was briefly studied before being placed in cold storage. Curators noted that the leather remained supple, as though recently worn, and that the rosemary retained its scent. More disturbingly, thermal imaging revealed a faint residual warmth in the fingers, unexplained by ambient conditions. The glove has never been displayed, but those who have handled it speak of a sensation akin to being gently grasped, not in warning, but in farewell. One conservator, years later, admitted in a private journal that she dreamed of a woman standing at the edge of a fog-draped street, holding out her bare right hand, waiting for its match. The dream recurred every year on the anniversary of the glove's discovery. She never returned to the archive, and so Miss Caldwyn endures, not as a monster, not as a madwoman, but as a testament to love's refusal to be bounded by death. Her horror is not in what she took, but in what she offered, the terrible, beautiful illusion that we might never truly lose those we hold dear. In an age of steam and steel, she chose thread and needle as her tools of defiance, stitching eternity into the ephemeral. And though her shop is gone, her name erased from directories, her gowns scattered or sealed away, her presence lingers in the hush between footsteps, in the rustle of silk in an empty room, in the quiet certainty that some promises are too strong to be broken, even by time. Thus, on certain evenings, when the gas lamps gutter and the fog curls like lace around the lampposts of Islington, one might pause outside the apothecary and feel it, not a draught, but a breath. And if one listens, truly listens, beneath the city's ceaseless murmur, there comes the soft, patient sound of a needle drawing thread through cloth, again and again, as though sewing the world back together, one lost soul at a time. The true measure of Miss Caldwyn's legacy may not lie in what was found, but in what continues to evade capture. Over the decades, numerous attempts have been made to reconstruct her methods, to isolate the precise alchemy of needle, thread, and intention that gave her work its uncanny vitality. In 1921, a society of experimental tailors in Soho, calling themselves the Guild of Silent Stitchers, sought to replicate her techniques using only period materials and documented practices. They succeeded only in producing garments of exquisite craftsmanship and profound stillness. One member, however, confessed before his sudden departure from London that during a late-night session, while sewing a bodice lined with human hair donated by volunteers, he felt the fabric lean into his hands as though guiding his needle. He abandoned the project the next morning, leaving behind a half-finished gown that his colleagues later burned, unsettled by its weight and the faint warmth it retained for days. This failure underscores a truth long suspected by those who study Miss Caldwyn. Her art was inseparable from her grief. It was not technique alone that animated her work, but the depth of her longing, a sorrow so absolute it became generative. She did not merely sew with thread. She sewed with absence. Each stitch was a plea, each seam a vow. And because grief, unlike joy, refuses to be contained, it seeped into the very fibers she handled, charging them with a quiet sentience. Modern conservators, trained to view textiles as inert, often report a disorienting sense of being observed when working on her pieces, not with menace, but with patient expectation, as though the garment awaits a reunion long deferred. This quality of waiting defines the lingering unease her creations provoke. Unlike haunted houses or cursed jewels, which announce their malevolence through cold spots or sudden noises, a Caldwyn gown operates through subtlety. It does not startle. It settles. It does not threaten. It invites. And therein lies its power. A woman who dons such a dress may feel at first an inexplicable comfort, the sense of being held, understood, accompanied. But over time, the boundary between wearer and worn begins to blur. Dreams become shared. Preferences shift. The wearer may find herself humming a tune she never learned, or reaching for a teacup with her left hand, though she is right-handed. These are not possessions in the demonic sense, but assimilations, gentle, inexorable, and born of love. The most poignant evidence of this phenomenon comes not from institutions, but from private letters preserved in family attics. In 1946, a woman in Devon wrote to her sister describing how her grandmother's Islington dress, a deep plum evening gown acquired in the 1880s, had begun to change after being stored for decades. "It smells of pipe smoke now," she wrote, though Grandmama never allowed smoking in the house. "And last night I swear I heard a man's voice say good night as I passed the wardrobe." The letter ends with a postscript. "I cannot bring myself to give it away. It feels like losing her all over again." Such accounts reveal that the horror of Miss Caldwyn's work is not its strangeness, but its familiarity, the way it mirrors our own desire to keep the dead close. To deny the finality of parting, even the act of documenting her story, seems to invite her presence. Researchers who delve too deeply often report odd coincidences, misplaced notes reappearing in unexpected places, photographs developing faint silhouettes in the background, or the recurrent appearance of a single strand of grey-threaded hair on their desks, though they own no such fabric. One archivist at the London Metropolitan Archives, while compiling a dossier on vanished artisans, found her office each morning filled with the scent of lavender and beeswax, though she used neither. On the day she closed the file, the scent vanished, and with it, 3 pages of her notes never recovered. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect of Miss Caldwyn's influence is its selectivity. Her gowns do not affect everyone. Some handle them with clinical detachment, noting only the quality of the stitching. Others are overwhelmed by a wave of melancholy so profound it borders on physical pain. This suggests that her work responds not to proximity, but to resonance, to those who carry their own unspoken losses, their own silent vows. In this light, her art becomes a mirror, not a curse, but a revelation of what the wearer already holds within. In recent years, digital archivists have attempted to map the dispersal of her known garments using museum databases, auction records, and private collections. The resulting network is sparse, fragmented, yet oddly symmetrical. Gowns surface in clusters every 20 to 30 years, always during periods of social upheaval or collective mourning, after the Great War, during the Blitz, in the wake of the AIDS crisis, and again in the quiet grief of the pandemic years, as though her creations awaken when the world is heavy with loss, offering their strange solace to those who understand the language of absence. No photograph of Miss Caldwyn is known to exist. Contemporary descriptions vary. Some recall her as severe, others as sorrowful. Some say she wore only black. Others insist her apron was always stained with dyes of every hue. This absence of image only deepens her mystery, allowing her to exist not as a person, but as a presence, an idea stitched into the cultural fabric. She has become less a historical figure than a folkloric constant. Like the green man or the black shuck, a spirit of longing given form through craft. And yet, for all the speculation, the core of her story remains achingly human. She was a woman who loved and lost and refused to let go. In a world that demanded women be silent, she spoke through silk. In an age that buried emotion beneath layers of decorum, she made grief wearable. Her crime was not madness but magnitude, loving too deeply, remembering too well, holding on too long. Thus, on certain nights, when the fog lies thick over Islington and the city's noise recedes to a whisper, one might stand before the apothecary's gleaming window and see, for just a moment, a reflection that is not one's own. A woman in a high-collared dress, her hands folded over a basket of thread, her eyes fixed not on the street, but on some distant point beyond time. And if the wind stirs the awning above, it carries with it the softest sound, not of footsteps, not of voices, but of a needle drawing thread through cloth, steady and ceaseless, as though stitching the veil between worlds ever thinner, ever more permeable, so that love, in the end, might never truly have to say goodbye.